A woman sitting under a palm tree was about to do something no Israelite general had the courage to do. As 900 iron-bladed chariots approached like a deadly storm and Israel's bravest men hid in the mountains, Deborah did the unthinkable. She not only challenged the most feared army of the time, she secured victory before the first sword was even raised. But here's the detail that will leave you speechless. Deborah was the only person in all of Israel who knew exactly when and where to strike. How? She had information that would change everything, and it came straight from heaven. What happened that day wasn't just a battle. It was the moment a prophetess proved that God's wisdom can transform terror into triumph. And there's a part of this story that almost no one tells. Something about the end of this battle that is so extraordinary that when you find out, you'll understand why Deborah is considered one of the most brilliant leaders in biblical history. Brace yourself. This isn't just the story of a courageous woman. It's the story of how hearing God's voice can change the impossible. You know that moment in history when everything seems lost, but then someone comes along and completely changes the game. In ancient Israel, at a time when remarkable biblical figures shaped the destiny of entire nations, there was a figure who defied all expectations. The biblical Deborah was not just another leader in a time of chaos. She was something rare, a prophetess who combined divine wisdom with brilliant military strategy. Imagine the scene: an oppressed people, powerful enemies everywhere, and in the midst of it all, a woman who received direct messages from God. We're not talking about made-up stories or ancient legends. We're talking about real history recorded in the sacred pages of the Bible. But here's what makes Deborah truly fascinating. She didn't just hear God's voice. She had the courage to act on it. While other leaders hesitated, she made decisions that seemed impossible. And this unique combination of faith and boldness was about to write one of the most extraordinary chapters in Israel's history. Why a woman? Why her exactly? The answer will surprise you. Visualize for a moment the absolute terror. The sun rose over the hills of Israel, but instead of bringing hope, each dawn brought only more fear. The roads were deserted. Merchant caravans had disappeared. Entire families took refuge in caves, praying that their enemies would not find them. The air was heavy, not only from the desert heat, but from the tension that suffocated every breath. Mothers cradled their children in absolute silence, fearing that even a cry could bring death. The fields, which should have been green with crops, lay abandoned and dry. This was how Israel lived, in constant terror. Israel's fate seemed sealed. The Canaanites, with their iron chariots and fearsome armies, controlled everything. 20 years, 2 decades of brutal oppression that had broken the spirit of an entire nation. But in the midst of this total darkness, there was a palm tree. And beneath that palm tree, a woman who would not accept that this was the final story of her people. The most unlikely biblical heroes were about to emerge from a place no one expected. And the question that echoed through the silent valleys of Israel was about to have a surprising answer. Who would be brave enough to face the impossible? Then something happened that no one saw coming. In a time when biblical leaders were typically warriors, God chose someone completely different. Deborah became Israel's judge, not by inheritance, not by military conquest, but because she possessed something few possessed, a direct connection to the divine. Beneath that palm tree, between Ramah and Bethel, something extraordinary happened daily. People came from all over Israel seeking justice, guidance, and wisdom. And Deborah, with her unwavering faith and leadership, offered answers that could only come from God. But make no mistake, this was no passive leader. The women of the Bible who made history had one thing in common. They didn't just wait for things to happen, they made things happen. Deborah was a prophetess, judge, counselor, and when necessary, military commander. She broke all the molds of what a leader should be. Because God is not limited by human standards. He chooses who He wants, when He wants, in the way He wants. And in those dark days, when Israel desperately needed direction, God had placed his chosen one exactly where she needed to be. The question was no longer, who will save us? The question was now, will we have the courage to follow the leader God has given us? There's something powerful about seeing courage where you least expect to find it. Female courage in the Bible is not a modern concept. It is a pattern established since ancient times. When we look at the women who changed history, we discover that God often chooses to use what the world considers weak to confound what appears to be strong. Deborah represented something revolutionary. The feminine power of the Bible, manifesting itself not just in words, but in strategic action and visionary leadership. She wasn't asking for permission to lead. She was leading because God had called her to do so. And here's something fascinating. In a culture where women rarely had a public voice, all of Israel recognized Deborah's authority. Why? Because when God anoints someone, it becomes undeniable. Her wisdom was so evident, her decisions so precise, that even the proudest men came to seek her counsel. If this story is inspiring you, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Stories like these deserve to be shared. But Deborah knew her greatest test of leadership was yet to come. Israel needed more than wise counsel. They needed deliverance. And that deliverance would require something that would test every fiber of their faith and courage. The moment of truth was coming, and with it, the opportunity to prove that when God calls, he also enables. And then came the moment that would change everything. Deborah wasn't just reacting to circumstances, she was receiving precise instructions from God. The revelation was clear. It was time to act. Deborah and Barak needed to join forces, but the initiative, vision, and strategy came from her. Imagine the scene. Deborah summons Barak, one of the few respected military commanders left in Israel. But instead of simply giving general orders, she shares specific details that could only come from a divine source. Go to Mount Tabor, take 10,000 men. I will draw Sisera and his army to the Kishon River. These weren't suggestions. It was a military plan revealed by God himself. Deborah's battle was about to begin, but there was a problem. Barak, even though he was a seasoned warrior, hesitated. He would only go if Deborah accompanied him. Interesting, isn't it? The military commander needed the prophetess's presence to give him courage. The biblical inspiration behind this story is clear. Sometimes faith and courage manifest themselves in the most unexpected places. And sometimes even the most seasoned warriors need the spiritual strength of those who hear God's voice. But Deborah knew something Barak didn't. Her presence on the battlefield wouldn't be just symbolic. She would be the key to a victory that would go down in history. But the path to victory is never simple, especially when you're facing the impossible. Mobilizing 10,000 men in a terrified nation is not easy. Where to find soldiers when most of the men were hiding in the mountains? How to convince people who had lost all hope that this time would be different? How to make an army believe it could defeat iron chariots with swords and spears? Deborah's story shows us that great leaders don't ignore obstacles. They turn them into opportunities to demonstrate faith. Every doubt the soldiers had was a chance to strengthen their trust in God. Every fear was an opportunity to remember that victory would come from above, not from human strength. And here's something few realize. Deborah wasn't just organizing a military battle, she was restoring the identity of a people. Women of faith like her understand that sometimes it's necessary to fight not just against external enemies, but against internal discouragement. The greatest challenge wasn't Sisera's 900 iron chariots. It was convincing a defeated people that there was still reason for hope. But when 10,000 men finally gathered on Mount Tabor, something changed in the air. Faith had found courage. The prophecy was about to come true. And Deborah knew that the next move would be decisive for Israel's future. What happened that day defied all the logic of ancient warfare. 10,000 Israelites descended from Mount Tabor as 900 iron chariots advanced like a deadly avalanche through the valley. By any military manual, this should have been Israel's last battle. But Deborah wasn't following military manuals. She was following divine instructions. And then, at the exact moment God had revealed, the extraordinary happened. A supernatural storm broke over the battlefield. The Kishon River, which had been just a small stream, became a raging torrent. The iron chariots, so feared and powerful, were stuck in the mud. Deborah's battle became a demonstration that when God fights alongside his people, the elements of nature become allies. Heaven and earth conspired in Israel's favor. But here's the surprising detail. Deborah had predicted exactly how and when this would happen. She wasn't waiting for a miracle. She was executing a divine plan revealed to her in advance. True biblical leaders don't rely solely on luck or human courage. They operate at the intersection of absolute faith and strategic action. And on that day, Israel rediscovered what it meant to have God as their supreme commander. When the battle ended, the most feared army in the region had been completely defeated. But the story wasn't over yet. The end of this battle held a surprise that no one could have imagined. When the sun set on that historic day, Israel had rediscovered something that seemed lost forever: the feeling of victory. But Deborah's celebration wasn't just about a battle won. It was about recognizing that God was still in control of his people's history. Women who have changed history know that true victories aren't just military. They're spiritual, emotional, and cultural. At that moment, something fundamental changed in Israel's mindset. A people who had lived in terror for 20 years suddenly remembered who they truly were: God's chosen people. And this transformation had been led by a prophetess who dared to believe that the impossible was possible. True biblical heroes don't seek personal recognition, they point to God. And that's exactly what Deborah did. Instead of taking all the credit, she led the people in a celebration that honored the one who had secured the victory. But there's something even deeper going on here. Deborah proved that authentic spiritual leadership transcends gender, age, or social background. When God anoints someone, it becomes evident to everyone around them. The physical victory had been won, but the spiritual victory was even more significant. Israel had rediscovered its identity and purpose, and the echoes of that victory would continue to resound for generations. But what can we learn from this extraordinary story that applies to our lives today? Deborah's faith and leadership teach us that hearing God's voice is only the first step. Having the courage to act on what we hear is what separates true leaders from mere dreamers. Deborah not only received divine revelation, she had the courage to stake everything on that revelation. The biblical inspiration behind this story is profound. God doesn't look for perfect people to carry out his plans. He looks for people who are available. Deborah was available to be used in a way that defied all the social conventions of her time. And here's a powerful lesson about female courage from the Bible. True strength isn't about physical power or social standing. It's about being aligned with God's purpose and having the courage to follow it, even when it means going against the grain. How many times do we let opportunities pass us by because we wait for someone more qualified to take the initiative? How many times does God want to use us, but we hesitate because we don't consider ourselves good enough? Deborah reminds us that when God calls, he also enables. And when he enables, even the impossible becomes inevitable. But there is one final lesson about Deborah that will change your perspective on leadership forever. Throughout the centuries, Deborah's story has continued to inspire people in impossible situations. Biblical women like her show us that authentic leadership isn't about title or position. It's about character and connection with God. In a time when women had little or no political power, Deborah wielded influence because her authority came from a source higher than any human system. Remarkable biblical characters have one thing in common: they transcend the limitations of their time and remain relevant millennia later. Deborah's story isn't just about an ancient military victory. It's about what happens when someone fully aligns with divine purpose. And here's something fascinating. Cultures around the world, even those that don't follow the Christian tradition, recognize Deborah as a symbol of wise and courageous leadership. This shows us that truth transcends cultural and religious boundaries. The stories, impactful stories like Deborah's, remain relevant because they address universal questions. How can we find courage in the midst of fear? How can we lead when all seems lost? How can we trust God when circumstances dictate otherwise? But there is something about Deborah's legacy that only reveals itself when we look at the full picture of her life. And that will show you why she wasn't just a leader, she was a visionary. Here's what makes Deborah truly extraordinary. She didn't just change the course of a battle, she changed the trajectory of a nation. Feminine power in the Bible manifests itself in many ways, but few as fully as in the story of Deborah. She was a prophetess, judge, military strategist, wise counselor, and above all, a woman who understood that her role was much greater than herself. After the victory over Sisera, Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years. 40 years! An entire generation grew up without knowing the oppression that had defined their parents' lives. And it all began with a woman who had the courage to believe that God's word was more trustworthy than any external circumstances. But here lies the most profound aspect of Deborah's legacy. She proved that godly leadership isn't about brute force or political manipulation. It's about hearing God's voice and having the courage to obey, even when it means facing the impossible. The women who changed history understood something fundamental. They weren't just fighting for themselves, but for generations not yet born. The impact of their decisions would echo through the centuries. And today, thousands of years later, we are still talking about a woman who proved that when God chooses someone, not even the most powerful enemy can resist. But there is one last revelation about Deborah that will leave you speechless. Now we come to that moment promised at the beginning. The revelation that shows Deborah's true genius. Remember, I said she knew something extraordinary about the battle's outcome. Here it is. Deborah didn't just predict victory, she predicted that the ultimate glory would not belong to Barak, nor to herself, but to another woman, Jael, who killed Sisera when he fled in defeat. This reveals something profound about true faith and courage. Great leaders don't need to be the center of the story. They need to ensure the story has the right ending. Deborah was willing to share and even cede the glory as long as God's purpose was fulfilled. Deborah's lessons for us are clear. God may be calling you to something that seems impossible. Others may doubt, circumstances may seem unfavorable, or you may feel inadequate. But if God is calling, He has already prepared the way. The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is, are you available? Do you have the courage to take the first step, even when you can't see the whole path? Deborah's story reminds us that biblical inspiration isn't just to be admired, it's to be lived. Somewhere in your life there's a palm tree waiting for you, a place where God wants to use you to make a difference. May Deborah's courage inspire you to discover your battle, and may you have the faith to believe that with God, every impossible victory becomes inevitable.